Hello and welcome. This is Boysen Hodgson, Communications and Marketing Director for the ManKind Project USA. In this off-the-cuff interview, I'll be speaking with Sam Keen and Gifford Keen, who have co-authored the new book, Prodigal Father Wayward Son, A Roadmap to Reconciliation. This interview was conducted in February 2015. Sam Keen, if you don't know, is the best-selling author of Fire in the Belly and a baker's dozen of other books. When he's not writing or traveling around the world, he lectures and leads seminars on a wide range of topics. He lives on a farm in the hills above Sonoma, California. And Gifford Keen has had careers as a software executive, a carpenter, a real estate investor. He's the father of a teenage son and daughter, and he lives with his wife in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he is a novelist. He meditates, practices yoga, and takes long walks in the high country. Sam and Gifford, really happy to be with you. Please say hello.
Hey, thanks.
Hello, and we're happy to be with you, too. We're looking forward to it. It's always a nice challenge to find out what people ask and if we have anything to say about it.
Nice. And I thought that a way that we could start off talking about Prodigal Father Wayward Son would be to recount a story from the book, because the book is really framed around this narrative of storytelling. And why don't we start with you, Gifford, recounting a story from the book or from your childhood?
Okay. Short introduction. One of the things we realized writing this book was that almost all the men we knew, when we talked to them, had 3 or 4, a small handful of sort of mythic stories about their fathers. And these were many, many memories, but only a few of these really primogenital stories that shaped their views of their fathers throughout their lives. Often they happened when they were young. So the story I want to tell, which I'll try and abbreviate, is one of the early chapters in the book. It's called Abraham, Isaac, and the Egg. And it was about one of the key stories that sort of became a lens through which I viewed my father for many years, right up until we wrote this book. So, when I was a young boy, very young, we lived in a red brick house on a tree-lined street in Louisville, Kentucky. My mom stayed at home, and my dad taught theology at the Presbyterian seminary. So, as you can imagine, religion was very big in our house, and somewhere really early on, I became confused about the exact relationship between my father and God. I never went as far as to think that he was God, but I certainly felt that he and God had a lot more in common than I did with either one of them. And to add to that, he had so many what appeared to me God-like traits, a big voice. He was sort of omnipotent and omnipowerful. And so, while I never did quite think he was a deity, I ended up thinking that he and God had a lot more in common with each other than either one of them did with me. Now, unfortunately for my dad, this did not engender the kind of respect that he would have liked, because I became deeply concerned about Christianity, again, at a very early age. And part of that happened one morning when my mom used to read to us Bible stories, mostly from the Old Testament, before school, with this big illustrated book for kids. So one morning she's reading me the story of Abraham and Isaac, and I'm asking questions like, what's a burnt offering, and things like that. And she may have been disturbed, but she kept on reading, and there on the last page is this just appalling diagram of poor little Isaac bound on the pier, and the pyre, and the knife coming down, and the angel catching Abraham's hand just at the last moment. He's like biting the angel. And I went to school, and I was really concerned. I mean, this was messed up. Was my dad gonna, slit my throat and burn me to a crisp if God told him to? I didn't know. And the fact that he and my dad and God seemed to be on much better terms with each other than I was with either of them did not help my worry. So, I tried to forget about it and made a strong mental note not to take any long walks with my dad. And that sort of went on for some time. I couldn't quite distinguish between the two of them. But then one summer, an event happened which became sort of mythical story in our whole family, not just for me, but for my sister as well. And this was the incident of the egg. Each summer, my dad used to pack the family up into our old VW bus, and we'd go driving around the country to somewhere or another, camping out. One day we were somewhere, I think, in Middle America. It was flat, probably now covered with GMO corn, and we pulled off the freeway and had a picnic, and afterwards we were sort of walking around not wanting to get back in, and my mom had gone off to take care of her business in the woods. Suddenly my dad calls me over. He says, "Gifford, get over here." And, this was bad. I knew this was bad. I came over and he's pointing down beneath the wheel of the van, and there's a partially eaten hard-boiled egg laying on the ground. "Gifford, why did you throw your food on the ground? You know we don't waste food." I said, "I didn't. It's not mine. I ate mine." And he said, "Don't lie." And which in his defense, I did have a habit of in those days. But, boy, we got into it, and before I knew it, he is just screaming at me, channeling the wrath of God himself, tendons sticking out on his neck, fists clenched, and anyone who's ever seen my dad mad knows that, this is not something to be taken lightly. And at the time, I just, So he made me eat the egg. And I ate it, sticks and ants and the whole deal. It was a lesson, he told me. And my mom came back, I'm crying. My sister Lael's standing petrified by the side of the van. My dad's still ranting. She says, "What's going on?" He says, "Well, Gifford threw his egg on the ground." And she said, "No, he didn't. He ate his. I saw him. It must have been Lael's." And she says, "Well, where were you anyhow?" He says to Bob. And only every time I heard her stand up to him, she said, "I was trying to go out in the woods and pee, so the cars couldn't see up my pussy," which was pretty heady stuff. I mean, I never even heard my dad cuss. First time I ever heard the word pussy. Anyhow, he looks at Lael and he looks at me and he sort of deflates. And here I expect, the sword to fall upon Lael's neck, his wrath to come upon her. But, he just mumbled something to her. And we got in the car and we drove away. And he never even said he was sorry to me or apologized. So that's the story. And
I should just add as a postscript that Lael felt guilty for almost all of her life because she never owned up to it.
I think she still does. I actually think of all of us, it was the most damaging for her. But it certainly became a story that became a primary myth and became a lens through which I saw my father. He'd always told me, a man apologizes when he's wrong, and he had this instilled in me, for which I'm really grateful, this tremendous sense of justice. Yet somehow that story said that he didn't live up to his own ideals, and it was something that I, even when I didn't think of it, lived in the back of my mind as the key archetype of how I viewed him.
Wonderful.
So maybe I'll take over from there.
Great.
You got to remember, first of all, that I never beat my son. I was never brutal in that way. I was in many ways just a good average parent, and I was doing what a man was supposed to do. My job was to shape up my son, to turn him into a man. And he had certain qualities, that were difficult for me. When he was up in his room at night, he had a thing, and it was dark, and he was afraid and came down and wanted to sit in the bed with us. And I said, no. And men, just tough it out. And he hurt himself, and I'd say, men don't cry. And I was he wanted to chop this big log, and I said, okay, chop the log if you can. He couldn't chop it, so it was like he wasn't manning up, and he could be.
When I was 5.
What?
When I was 5, sorry.
Yeah, I'm saying it was when he was 5. See, and I was a professional. And I was trying to man up myself, so I was trying to get him to man up. And I remember we were working on the fence out in the back, and we were digging these deep post holes and everything. He said, "Can I dig one?" I said, "You couldn't do that. You're not strong enough to do that or anything like that." So I go in the house and come back out about 3/4 of an hour later, and damn if he hasn't dug a post hole so deep we had to fill half of it in again. Sort of gave me pause. But I think a major theme of his growing up was that I felt he wasn't manly enough, and I had to turn him in. All those things that later on the author of Fire in the Belly said was anathema. Be a man, don't cry, buck up. That was my style of parenting in those days, and it wasn't much fun for any of us.
Wonderful.
And with Leo, you never did with Leo, my sister.
No, Leo was different. Girls, they weren't half the trouble. I couldn't write a book about fathers and daughters. I don't think we didn't have enough conflict.
Interesting. So,
but you see, I was an average man in that way. I was doing I was just fulfilling what it was that a man's duty was. I was supposed to make the living, which I did, and I was not supposed to be primarily in charge of raising the children. That my wife did that, and so it was frustrating.
Interesting. Yes. So, Gifford, you started us off by talking about these 4, half a dozen primary myths that kind of inform and color a lens. You use the word lens in the book for how we see the world. So, talk about how, as an adult now, and with your dad in relationship, how that was the background for your relationships. If that does that question make sense? Like that's strong for me in the book, how all of these myths color everything we see, so that my conversation with my father, for example, even today, as I was telling you guys, is colored by so many other things in the past.
Well, would you mind if I started by just reading a couple paragraphs from the book that I think...
I would love it.
Okay, this is from a chapter entitled Ghost Stories. It is startling to reread the stories of our early conflicts, to see them rendered in black and white, starkly printed on the page with no room for equivocation, no way to avoid their poignancy or soften their sting. In one way, this handful of stories is as familiar to me as my own face in the mirror. They had been a part of me for so long I had almost forgotten they were there, riding my shoulder, whispering in my ear, their voices just below the threshold of perception. These haunting memories have exercised a profound effect upon our relationship. Over the years, as my psyche evolved around them, these stories became strangely opaque, like a collection of sealed boxes with a label on the front. Each one stood whole, a simple shorthand symbol for the whirlwind of complex emotional responses packed inside. Unopened, overtold, unexamined, I was unable to interpret them from any perspective but that of the child who had crammed those memories into those boxes, slammed the lids, and turned the keys so many years ago. But now, when I take them out, dust them off, and render them into writing, the stories seem very strange, so often polished with unconscious retelling. They have an overproduced, movie-like quality, as if they were made up or had happened to someone else. And in truth, hard as I try, I can barely recognize either you or myself as actors in these spectral plays.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So I think that I was talking with you about this yesterday a little. We tell these stories over and over again. But what was different when we told them to each other in this book? And I think that's sort of it's a difference between ritual and routine. For so many years, the stories were told routinely, and the emotional responses to them never changed. They were told without attention. They were told without any kind of real examination of what they were. And it wasn't until we started writing the book and started telling these stories. I mean, writing it down, just to start with, made it a very odd exercise. Mm. But I did it we started telling the stories with really intention and attention. And it was only then, as I say in that paragraph, that suddenly they seemed very strange. So for example, the story of the egg, I had always had this as a story of injustice, the wrong that was done to me and what a bastard my dad was, But then when I wrote it down, in my 50s, now as the father to my own son, the much more obvious question occurred to me, which was, what are you doing losing your shit over a 5-cent egg? Why are you screaming at this kid over this egg? And I asked my dad this question, and it led to a whole set of conversations, about what was going on with him.
There was something that came in between those two, which fueled everything. So all along, we're sort of edging toward knowing each other, but there's all this tension and all this fighting, and then we have this, because I was still being the victor and he's the victim, and then everything broke when we had this fight. We had breakfast together, and I was going back to California, and suddenly we were out in the streets of Santa Fe, and before I know it, we were screaming at each other at the top of the... I couldn't quite understand what happened. It turns out, when we thought about it, I was doing the same old thing. I was putting him down, and he was making me feel guilty, and we were screaming at each other, and I didn't know whether we'd ever talk to each other again. And then in a week or so, whenever it was, we started talking to each other again. I think it was Giff who said, "Look, Dad, the reason we're in trouble is we're telling these same old crappy stories all the time, and it's the same old story. You're the oppressor, and I'm the victim. And I think that we need to tell each other some different stories." And he says, for instance, what I want to know about you is how did you become the man you are? And I said, well, that's what I want to know about you, too. So why don't you pick out stories that were important in you coming to be who you were, and you write them to me, and I'll write back to you. And that's how we got this book going. And what happened was, once we did that, we realized that we'd stumbled into something that was very valuable and very rare and very unknown. That is, the men's movement that talked about initiation, they talked about drumming, and they talked about all these ritual things that they do, go out in the woods and do that kind of thing. And that wasn't what it was. We said, wait a minute, no. We initiated each other when we began to tell the stories. I didn't know who he was. He didn't know who I was. It was in the act of discovering and telling those stories that we began to understand that that's the essence of real initiation. Tell me who you were, Dad. What was it like for you? That's what I needed to know, and what he did too.
I love the way that you wrote about, this was not an easy task to actually really begin to explore this in a conscious way, as you said, Giff, with that kind of presence and ritual aspect. So talk more about vulnerability in this and where you guys ended up.
Well, maybe I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was the first vulnerable one, and then Gifford came back in spades with it. I realized that the things I'd never told Gifford were things I was deeply ashamed of. Ways that I acted during the divorce where I just did not really take him with me, and that I'd never told anybody about that because I was just deeply ashamed. And I realized if I was going to be if I was going to let my son in on what I was about, I had to tell him those stories, and that was very painful. And then he had, you go ahead, get about yours.
Well, I mean, I guess I would say the whole thing about this process was that it's filled with sort of dichotomies. On the one hand, one of your questions was, what's changed between you guys? And on the one hand, in some ways, nothing's changed. Mm-hmm. But in other ways, everything has changed. And another dichotomy was that in some ways, this was one of the hardest things I've ever done, particularly writing some of the sections about, wanting to kill myself when I was 11 and living in Prescott and getting beaten up in school by the rednecks when my dad gone. And, that was really hard to write about.
Yeah.
So in some ways, this was an incredibly difficult process. But in other ways, it was incredibly easy, right? It was so natural. It was so simple. I mean, there's nothing more archetypal to humanity, to mankind, than telling stories. Mm-hmm. That's what we do. That's, I think, one of the things that defines us as humans. So, once we started on the process, it really took on a life of its own.
Very nice. Yeah.
And, maybe let's go to the absolute heart of the thing and then come back to it. Everything changed. We'd had to fight. We had all those things, and everything was going along in a jerky way. And I went to Iran with my wife, and I was there doing a thing on citizen diplomacy, and I was having lunch up on a big table, and I fell, and I hit my head on a steel rod and fell another 4 feet to a stone floor. And they CAT scanned me and brought me back home, and within a couple of weeks, I had to get I had a subdural hematoma and had to have three brain surgeries. Well, Gifford came in. Was it the first one, Giff, or was it the last one?
Right after the last one, when they thought you were going to have to get the craniotomy.
Oh, yeah, they thought I was going to have to get a craniotomy. And Gifford came from Santa Fe, and I guess it was when we were walking on the path that happened, Giff?
Yeah, it had been, we were sort of waiting to see, going off and on to the hospital, waiting to see if you'd have to get there. They'd been drilling holes in his head, basically, to relieve the pressure.
Real holes?
Small holes, but they were getting ready to do the sort of jigs, cut out a big piece of his skull with the medical equivalent of a jigsaw. So, we were waiting around to see what was going to happen. And
a little walk.
Every day.
Log, as I remember it, and Gifford came over and he said, "Dad, there's no way to say this, but whatever I thought I had against you, the statute of limitations has run out." Well, that was the moment where everything changed. He was telling me he wasn't going to cling to the old story. He was telling me that the magic thing had happened. He forgave me. He forgave me. And that then really lubricated the stories. After he did that, there was no use my holding back on any of the stories. He'd already forgiven me for the worst thing he'd done. Now,
the funny thing. Go ahead.
Maybe you want to put in your stuff about forgiveness. I think that's very powerful.
Well, I mean, and the interesting thing about that moment, and like so many epiphanies in my life, that one came unbidden and unpremeditated, and I didn't understand what it meant really until much later. But the interesting thing about that was that it wasn't like I forgot everything. It wasn't like a lot of the wounds didn't still hurt.
Right.
It's just I'm 50 years old. I'm going to take responsibility. I'm not going to blame you for it anymore, right? At this point, I'm responsible for my own past, and I've been a Buddhist meditator for 15 years, and that's one thing that you teach is you're responsible for your own emotions and your own thoughts.
Right.
But still, a lot of the pain was still there. And then when we started writing this book, and at one point, I was sitting on the lanai in Hawaii talking to my dad. We're about halfway through with the book, 3/4 of the way through with the first draft. It was going well, and we chatted, and, just as we were getting ready to hang up, he says to me, well, I'm having one trouble with the book. And I'm kind of having trouble. I said, what's that? He says, well, it makes me really sad to realize how cruel it was of me to leave the family. And I remember when he said that, my mind went really still, and suddenly my attention was just really focused. And I said to him after a minute, well, why is that a problem? He said, well, it makes me kind of sad. And, then we hung up, and it wasn't until afterwards, I just was sitting there stunned, and I realized I'd been waiting 40 years to hear those words, because after he left, and by the time I was a teenager, he'd call on the phone, and he'd tell me how bad he felt, and sometimes he'd cry, and he'd say how lonely he was. And, I'd hold the phone out from my ear, just waiting for that, break in his tone so I could hang up. I didn't want to hear it anymore, right? I was sort of pissed. And for years afterwards, this whole purgatorial period we had where I was grown up and I was doing well, and on the surface everything was great between us. But underneath there was this constant tension, this constant dis-ease, and I was always after him. I was always pressing him. I wouldn't let any of the issues rest. And he'd say to me, more than once, I remember him turning to me in frustration and asking, what do you want from me? And with those two short sentences on the phone, it all came into focus, In all the years of our dissatisfying conversations, I'd only heard him talk about how he felt, his guilt, his sadness, his struggle to break free of his father's taboos and his mother's fundamentalism. But now, for the first time, he was filled with compassion for my pain. And, the father-son injuries of my childhood haunted me for years. And I really didn't, even after I had taken responsibility, stopped blaming them for them, I never really expected to be free of them. But when I had my son, and he and I became so close, that changed a lot. It was almost as if my closeness with him had granted me some magical ability to travel backwards in time and change the past. And the resentment and bitterness that I felt for my dad for so long eroded, and all the happy hours with Jasper, my son, sort of overlaid the memories of his disapproval and his absence, leaving in its wake this sort of comfortable sadness. And if that sounds like a strange juxtaposition, comfortable sadness, it's really not. I realized that this isn't a sadness that wants anything or blames anything. Yeah. It's just a recognition of what is.
That's what was lost, really. What was lost all those
That's
years.
Right.
We could have had that and didn't.
Well, and I felt that sadness so much more for you than for myself, right? That you and I never knew the sweetness between a father and a young son that with Jasper has been one of the really peak experiences of my life.
Tell there about your experiences that maybe I didn't forgive you because I didn't.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
So, we're almost done writing the book. We've actually finished it, and we started, and then still something seemed missing. So one of the things, as I get older, particularly as I look at family relationships and especially relationships between parents and children, I really have a hard time understanding concepts of blame. Who's to blame for what? It's very complicated and it doesn't seem to work. But I'm also increasingly impressed by looking at things as a system of positive and negative feedback loops.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
And if you look at things that way, it becomes pretty obvious that, everyone, first of all, things are easier to stop. And for another, it becomes, pretty clear that everyone has their own part to play in it. Okay, so I've always thought of that. Let me read a quick paragraph.
Tell them about your realization.
I will. Just let me read this. He can always edit it all out later, right?
I'm not editing it. I'm not going to edit anything out.
No, too bad. In the early years, our relationship was like the Vietnam War. You were the Americans. There was no way I could stand against your military might. I was simply outgunned. Your razor intellect was a helicopter gunship I couldn't hope to fight from the ground. When I tried to dig in, you brought out the heavy artillery of righteousness and authority. And when all else failed, you scorched my jungle refuge with the napalm of your rage. But I was the Viet Cong. You could never pin me down or root me out. I dug pits of dishonesty for you to fall into and planted the sharpened pungy stakes of indolence in the ground. I buried landmines of malingering and sloth on the trails you traversed, waiting to explode the shaky image of your manhood with my cultivated inadequacies. I infiltrated the haven of your heart and struck you down with guilt from the only quarters you believed safe. So, when I actually realized how much of a part I had played in this, conscious or unconscious, when I was gunning for him ever since the '80s, ever since I was 3 years old, I was gunning for it, man. Mm-hmm. And, but we had this unconscious narrative of him as the oppressor and me as the victim. And of course the victim can always justify any sort of atrocities, right, as just self-defense. And I realized that I had my share of atrocities, that I had been really cruel to him, and I went in one morning and Jasper, my son, hops up and he gives me this big hug. And he says, Dad, I love you so much. You're the greatest, man. And it just lit me up like a 1,000-watt light bulb. And I thought, I never gave that to my dad. Mm-hmm. I always withheld that from him. And, it made me feel really bad. And so I wrote to him and I said, look, for this process to be complete, you also have to forgive me for the atrocities that I perpetrated on you. And he wrote back and he said, oh yeah, that's right, you used to flip me the bird, and I tried to take a picture, and you smoked too much dope, and you didn't like to shower. And I wrote back to him and I said, no, that's not what I'm talking about, not the picadillos. And I think that I said, I don't think you have ever been able to admit how much it was that I hurt you, right? And that was a big moment, I think as men, we're supposed to be tough.
Right.
How many times do you see, like, a little kid fall down, a boy, fall down hard, hit him, he hops up, fighting back tears and says, that didn't hurt, mm-hmm. Right? And so that was one of the sort of final breakthroughs in the thing, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, but something changed. You'll notice in the book too, something changes. We've been telling, in a certain sense, the atrocity stories and about how we blamed each other, and we've been dealing with the dark stuff. Once we began to deal with the dark stuff, a whole different mood. I mean, this book, more than half of it is quite joyful and lighthearted. When I start telling him my stories about being a man, about how I manned up, and he tells me, and I tell him stories about what it meant to face fear when I was skin diving on a wreck, and he telling me about what happened when he was on a cliff, and
that one got cut, actually.
It was?
That one got cut from the book, but yeah.
And and all of the kind of wild things that we had done and that were important in making us the kind of men that we were. What I mean, he'd been in a job where he was making six figures a year, and he quit that job because it wasn't what he wanted to do. He wanted to raise his kids, and I had been a full professor with tenure and everything, and I quit that. And we had a lot more extraordinary stories to tell about what we did on our own to become a man, and it was sharing those that in some ways I began to get a lot more new respect for what he did, and I think he did for me. So,
well, and I think... Go ahead.
Yeah, well, just that, that's when the I almost want to say triumphant stories began to emerge, and not the stories of telling these stories. We didn't need forgiveness from each other. We just needed an audience. You say, "You did that? Hell, what was that like, Dad?" And everything by that time had changed. The mood had changed between us so radically, from first his forgiving me, and then my realizing that I had to forgive him. I had longed for what is the affection that he could have given me, and then everything changed.
Yeah, and I think that's an example of how everything changed and nothing changed. I mean, all those hard, dark stories we told are still very much part of us. They always will be, right? But through the telling of them and the sort of demythologizing of them, they stopped being the only way we could perceive each other. We still, those things are still real. Mm-hmm. We still perceive each other in those ways.
A tiny example of that. Giff was supposed to go climbing with a friend. His friend bugged out on him, and he says, so I said, let's fly to Hawaii for 4 or 5 days. So we do that, and just we're out there, free diving and everything else, and we've only got about 20 minutes to go before we have to go and catch our plane. And here, we look down into the depths about 20 feet down there. Honest to God, the nearest thing you ever saw of a mermaid. Just beautiful, beautiful Asian girl with long flowing hair. And she must have been able to hold her breath for 3 minutes, because I don't think we ever saw a surface. We went down there and swam around her, came back up, and swam the shore. I said, Giff, did you see that? You see how she was looking at me and everything? Giff said, no, Dad. She was looking at me, not you.
She was definitely beckoning to me.
Beckoning to me. He still doesn't admit she was beckoning to me. But
I would have gone too, but I was afraid I'd never come back.
But we could have all kinds of differences of opinion. They never escalated. But it wasn't also a perfect kumbaya. I mean, even in writing this book, we would reach sometimes where we would have minor screaming fits at each other, but it would only be maybe 5 minutes, and we didn't hold on.
So in some sense, one of the things that came through to me in the book, and you've been both speaking to it, is that the idea of forgiveness as a threshold to something else, and that is kind of the initiation process. That it's when you let go of your fixed attachment, a great Buddhist term, let go of the fixed attachment to what all of these events meant, and embrace each other with a sense of forgiveness, then the kind of importance of the stories shifts. And you both started seeing the world, seeing all of these old stories in a different way. I think it's wonderful. And I loved Giff. I loved the accountability that each of you at the end of the book, I mean, both of you just get really accountable for what happened. And when there is forgiveness, there doesn't have to be shame or upset about it. It's like, wow, this happened. And that's
Well, I think when there's truth... Say again, Father?
Just on the practical level, Giff and I talk for each other, I don't know, a couple hours or more every week now. He's my best buddy. I can talk to him about anything, and he me. It's just like having found, instead of a snot-nosed son, this great friend.
Yeah.
Well, I think that just backing up a second to the process, I think this process is, again, like I say, archetypal.
Yeah.
Forgiveness, it wasn't like there was some great hurdle we had to overcome to forgive. I think the hurdle was to tell the truth. And once you tell the truth to each other in a way that's not blaming, just honest, when the truth comes out that forgiveness is inevitable, it's easy, there's no way. I guess that's a Buddhist idea too. There's only ignorance, Once you see the truth, compassion is the only really possible reaction.
Sure.
And I think that, this is what we found, the sort of power and simplicity of this process. Again, storytelling is archetypal.
Yes.
And if you really commit yourself to the stories, then all of this other stuff seems almost inevitable, right? We had no idea when we began this book where it would lead us. We could never have written the end at the beginning or even really conceived of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, all that old, so I guess what I would say is all the old stuff is still there, right? But instead of that, when I was out there, we were out there sort of finishing off the book, I was visiting my dad, we got into it one morning, and I just completely lost my junk at him, screaming, lost my temper, almost never do that, Still happens, right? The thing is, 10 minutes later, everything's okay.
Yeah.
And those old stories are now only a small part of what we can share, right? They're still there. They're still just as strong, but now they're much less. Now they're a small part of our relationship rather than the whole thing. Sorry, go ahead.
They're boring. We've heard them and heard them and heard them. It's like, okay, tell me a new story.
Well, now that we've told them truthfully in the light of day, we don't need to keep telling them, right?
Yeah.
We can stop. We can go on to more interesting stuff.
Yeah, Gifford,
I think the great contribution of this book, in a way, is just that it shows the power of a very simple process. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to tell somebody a story. You just have to get up to your dander and say, look, I'm going to tell you who I am. I'm going to tell you things, Tell me things about you. Tell me.
Yes.
The magic is in the telling of the story.
Well, and the listening, too.
With presence, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily in the telling of the story, because my dad's heard my tales of woe, and I've certainly heard my dad's tales of woe, and the presence kind of determines how that goes, yes? So how intentional am I listening? How intentional am I being about compassion, as you said, or understanding, or just being present to, his truth, or him being present to my truth about what happened.
Right. And for me, actually, it was being present to my own truth. That was the thing that really surprised me, as I started telling these stories, particularly the original ones. They just didn't seem right. Wait a second, this is a weird story. Was I really that much of a wimp? Was I really that, I had sort of painted myself into a picture of myself that I don't even think was really accurate. And maybe when I was a kid, but certainly not by the time I was a teenager, definitely not in my 20s, and long, long gone in my 40s, but still, that was the controlling metaphor. So
I think there's another enormous cultural significance in this. We ask, who are men, what are they becoming, what's new? And I think this establishes really the bottom line. The bottom line is men tell the truth. And we're in trouble because men don't tell the truth. You look at everything from Abu Ghraib to what we're doing, and they're all, our governments are lying to us. The people who should tell us the truth, even if it's difficult truth, aren't telling it. So the first thing I don't want men who have lumberjack aspirations, or metasexuals or whatever they are. The first thing I want men just to start telling the truth about their world. That's the most manly thing you can do, is tell the truth.
That's really good.
Yes.
One of the questions Boysen sent was, how did writing this book change my ideas of my masculinity?
Yes.
And I guess I don't think that much about my masculinity. So it took me a minute to sort of come up with, because I sensed there was a big change, and I think that's really the basis of it, is sort of telling the truth. When we were able to finally tell the truth to each other about these things, for one thing, it healed all these old wounds. It really did. They were things that had crippled me much of my life. So when those were gone, I was much stronger as a person, as a man. And not only that, I was able to respond authentically and truthfully, not only to my father, but to everyone else around me, on the basis of what was happening right then, in front of me, right now, rather than through some injury, through some past view, through some fundamentally false sense of who I was and who they were. So, I guess I would say, I hadn't quite put it in those terms till you said it, but the truth, certainly being able to tell the truth, has made me feel much more strong as a man, and sort of secure in my masculinity, right? And I don't have to hide anything from anybody anymore. And
also true on a social level. What if we started telling the truth about rendition and torture and what we have done, instead of trying to suppress the report that our own government is making about us. We have to start telling the truth politically. The world is too dangerous to keep lying.
Wonderful. And it's something that resonates very deeply for me, being involved with the ManKind Project and the work that we do. In the New Warrior Training Adventure, our program, one of the very first processes that happens in the New Warrior Training Program is called accountability. And that sets the stage for the entire weekend. And that is absolutely about that fundamental truth-telling. Without shame, without blame, we're not going to attack you, we're not going to tear you apart. Learn to tell the truth and take responsibility for your actions and your choices, and the consequences, intended or unintended, of that telling the truth or not telling the truth. Very good. So, Sam, has this experience, this reconciliation experience, had any impact on your views on masculinity? Truth-telling and integrity is something that is certainly part of Fire in the Belly. Has this shifted anything for you?
You asked me that about it has not changed my ideas.
Yeah.
It's changed me.
Mm.
I mean, it's sort of like
well said.
You go back to Fire in the Belly and say, what is a good idea that men don't say, man up, and men don't cry? I say, yeah, I wrote it myself.
Right.
Well, did I do it? Well, not how I do it, but that's the great thing about being a writer. Sometimes, at long last, you learn the truth of your own ideas.
Beautiful.
There was a moment. Sorry, go ahead.
So no, it's been more coming of letting those things seep deep into me and change my way of being.
There was a moment about, 3-4 months into the writing of this, when I said, hey, wait a second, isn't what we're doing almost exactly like what you and Joseph Campbell used to do with the whole personal mythology thing? And you were like, oh, yeah, I guess it is. We just sort of had never occurred to us to apply it to ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. Yes, so you guys created your rite of passage through this telling.
Inadvertently.
Yes, it's wonderful.
This is going to replace all those drums the men were beating in the wilderness.
So I have some attachment to those drums beating in the wilderness as part of a ritual.
Well, beat the drum slowly and tell the story slowly.
Can you say that again, please?
Beat the drum slowly and tell the story slowly.
That's, yes, gorgeous, beautiful. So I want to get to the end here. We've been about 50 minutes. I'm feeling really grateful and happy. The book has impacted me. I can't wait to share it. Can't wait to share it with my dad. Can't wait to share it with other men that I know in the ManKind project. There's beautiful stories in here. It really gets to the heart of this forgiveness and reconnection. I loved it. Yeah, Prodigal Father, Wayward Son, Sam Keen and Gifford Keen. And I want to make a request. Sam, do you have a copy of the book in front of you?
Yeah.
There's a paragraph, bottom of page 158 in the PDF copy that I have, that it's talking about the house that you built with Gifford in Sonoma. This paragraph really impacted me, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to read that paragraph.
That's the one that begins, now a quarter of a century?
That's the one.
Okay, and this is a paragraph about when Gifford and I had just finished building my house. Now, a quarter of a century later, when the wind and torrential rains sweep down the valley like a wild banshee, the house creaks a little like a ship under sail, and I sit confidently in my living room, remembering how many storms we have weathered, knowing that what we built together was built to last. Daily, as I inhabit this consecrated house, I feel an abiding sense of gratitude to you. What you helped me do was not merely construct a house, but create a world that encompassed the height and depth of my being. Because you are forever an integral part of my life, blood of my blood, bone of my bone. You were the only one who could help me perform the archetypal act by which the prodigal father could come home. Thank you, my son.
Thank you very much for reading that. Gifford, is there anything that you'd like to say in closing?
No, I think we've said it. Really appreciate your time and your interest and all your kind words about the book.
So, Sam Keen, Gifford Keen, thank you so much for being with me today. The book is Prodigal Father, Wayward Son. I will definitely post a link with this interview, and thank you, men, for sharing this time with me.